The fourth of my screencasts introducing King Lear to year 13 focuses on the character of the Fool and Act 1, Scene 4, this being the first scene in which the Fool appears. It isn't necessarily a whole reading of the character of the Fool. I certainly don't go into great detail about the Fool as he moves through Act 2 and 3. However, towards the end of this screencast, there is a brief comment about what will happen beyond. But these introductory screencasts are really aimed at enabling students, using them carefully as they read Act 1, to develop their own trains of thoughts more easily as they go through the play. So, without further ado, let's move on. Act 1, Scene 4 is a very long scene, 344 lines or so. Immense, really. The first act of this play is enormous. Act 1, Scene 1, huge. Act 1, Scene 4, huge. There are shorter scenes, 2, 3 and 5, but as an overall, this is a really imposing act to start the play, and it's because of the weight of these scenes that I'm devoting these screencasts to them alone rather than looking in more general terms at the play. It is written in a mixture of prose and verse, as you'll want to discuss, no doubt, moving up to verse when Goneril enters the stage, perhaps suggesting her status, certainly suggesting in the argument, as it were, between her and Lear, this sense of two great, powerful people in debate. And yet, within the prose, the little doggerel snatches of verse and so on that the Fool uses perhaps are even more highlighted because of the nature of what is happening around him. It's a scene that introduces Kent in disguise, a vital character that is going to run throughout the whole play as Lear's supporter. And we have to accept the trope of disguise. It's a very typical device for theatre of this time, and although really most of us can probably see through the false beard or whatever it might be, and we suspend our disbelief and it works perfectly well. It's a scene that establishes the teams, if you like. The treatment of Lear by Oswald, the later humiliation by Goneril, and that's balanced by Kent and the Fool becoming a pair themselves. We see, bless me, we see that the Fool has not been in the play thus far, and one of the knights, the third knight, refers to this when sent to fetch the Fool. Since my young lady's going into France, so the Fool hath much pined away. And a link is established here clearly between Cordelia and the Fool. Taking away Cordelia, the symbol of goodness and honesty, has caused the Fool to perhaps lose his health, his power, his vivacity, and yet we have to see that with Cordelia gone, Lear is possibly in even greater need of somebody to act affectionately towards him and to act as his protector, and that character, therefore, is the Fool. Goneril refers to him on line 191 as an all-licensed fool, and it's worth just quickly digressing to talk about fools in general. Fools are part of court. They're licensed to tell the truth and to entertain. They don't fear harm when telling the truth. That is how a fool works. And it's evident that although Lear has divested himself of the kingdom, he still has kept around him the trappings of court. He still has 100 knights at this point. He still has a fool. It is as though he is still king. He just doesn't do any ruling. And we looked in the first of these screencasts at the idea of the body politic and the body natural. And again, I think here we need to have our attention drawn early in the play to the way in which Lear is seeking to maintain the nature of his kingship, although he has also sought to divest himself of it. So, the character of the Fool seems to be somebody who is allowed to tell the king the truth. Kent, perceptive as ever, is able to point this out on line 144, when he says, "This is not altogether full, my lord," responding to the fool's many jokes and many japes. And in the world that has been overturned, Kent is a figure of sanity. We've already established that early in the play, particularly in 1-1 when he talks freedom lives hence and banishment is here. And when he first appears in line 101, the fool is able to make a direct connection with this speech that we recall. The fool, remember, wasn't present on stage in Act 1, Scene 1. And yet comes out with this line that this fellow has banished 2 on's daughters and did the third a blessing against his will. The idea that he has banished 2 of his daughters, well, of course he hasn't. They're still on stage and they are now running the kingdom. But in this topsy-turvy world that Kent has referred to, banishment is here. The fool taps into this idea directly and thus establishes a connection between himself and Kent that will run through the rest of the scene. The first 100 lines or so that the fool is on stage, we see a constant stream of jokes aimed at pointing out Lear's folly. They are many. He sets up around line 136 the question of whether Lear can spot the sweet and bitter fool. And this joke concludes with the one in motley here, i.e. himself, dressed in motley in the fool's uniform. The other found out there, pointing at Lear. The idea that Lear is seen as a bitter fool. Before anybody can take too great an offence at this, the egg double crown joke hints both at the division of the kingdom and the loss of Lear's power within that kingdom. The meat of the egg has vanished. But also the little wit that is to be found in Lear's bald crown in his head. And hence, by extension, proving that wise men are grown foppish and that Lear's actions are the actions of, well, a fool. Another of his jokes, this time altogether more interesting in many ways, because it both manages to combine the image of Lear as a child, having to learn as he goes through life, or what's left of life, but also introducing a really obscene jibe into the scene in terms of Lear's actual condition vis-a-vis his daughters. Thou gavest them, the daughters, the rod and putst down thine own breeches. Lear is being told that that his daughters have been made into his mother and that they are chastising him. Not only that, thou hast pared thy wit a both sides and left nothing its middle. The idea that his wit has been either fined down to nothing, so there's nothing left in the middle as he's attacked on both sides, but as that line actually then goes on to conclude, the 2 sides are the 2 daughters, and Lear has been left with nothing at all. Now, this is the way he starts the scene, beginning his attacks, his jibes on Lear. Once Goneril arrives after line 180, he takes his license still further because he is able to attack both her and Regan. He seems to be able to see what Lear can't. The daughters are the cause of his undoing and will undoubtedly be the cause of his death. And he comes into this through these nonsensical verses. He that keeps nor crust nor crumb, weary of all, shall want some. Yes, he's singing about bread, crust of bread, the crumb, the actual interior of the bread, the bit that sustains us. But the metaphor works for Lear in the sense that the crust is, if you like, the outward show of his kingliness. The crumb, the inner workings of the kingship, and harking back again to the body politic and the body natural being indivisible. Lear can keep neither, we're told. Not only that, he also tells us the hedge sparrow fed the cuckoo so long that it had its head bit off by its young. Again, a clear notion that Goneril and Regan are now cuckoos in the nest. Cuckoos will kill the nest owner. Goneril and Regan will kill Lear. Now this is an interesting rhyme, and it's a rhyme that's worth looking at in its full extent. It isn't just that it is childish in tone, but it also suggests a childishness, a vulnerability in the fool. That couplet that I cited a moment ago, the hedge sparrow fed the cuckoo so long that it had its head bit off by its young, then concludes with a third line, so out went the candle and we were left darkling. The metre is clumsier altogether, perhaps signifying a rather sudden ending, a rather pointed ending. And the image is very clear, that of a child's terror of the dark, the child who's left alone, its candle blown out, the one glimmer that helped it keep its sanity, if you like, is removed. And it's clear that the fool is telling us that Lear has created a figurative darkness, falling on the kingdom by his actions. We were left darkling. By Lear's actions, all the good men, we, are now blundering around in the dark, having lost their direction and frightened. Now, the childish nature of the fool has already been hinted at. We see that the mode of address, I mean, it's interesting that Lear and the fool alternate thou and you to each other regularly, perhaps hinting at this very close relationship and, essentially an adult-child relationship at times. The constant use of nuncle, this endearing little epithet that the fool uses, a shortened form of mine uncle, suggesting again the very close relationship. But we notice that as the fool leaves at the end of this scene, dismissed unceremoniously by Goneril, and let's face it, after the way he's spoken to her, he's not going to find any welcome there. There's a real desperation, an urgency in the cries as he runs off stage. Nuncle Lear, tarry and take the fool with thee. He seems to be desperately afraid that he's going to be left behind. Nuncle Lear. It's an interesting address for a man who is used to being referred to as my lord, great king, and so on. The fool can do this. The fool can get underneath the king and into the reality of the man that lies beneath. Now, I said at the beginning, I don't want to spend too long looking ahead. I mean, I find one of the problems of making screencasts for King Lear, frankly, is that there is so much to say. One could talk for hours. But it's worth just looking ahead slightly. We look in 1.5 at the continued nudging of Lear with his jokes. The snail joke is a traditional cuckoldry jibe, that sense of hiding the horns under the shell. The fool adds great seasoning to it with the comment not to give it away to his daughters. He's constantly nagging at Lear in this way, before telling him in line 41, thou shouldst not been old before thou wast wise, letting him know how much he has to learn, and by implication, of course, suggesting that he is going to be Lear's tutor at this stage. Now, he will vanish at the height of the storm in 3.6. But by that stage, I think we will have found that he has used all this apparent nonsense that he's talking at times to educate Lear. Remember, the world has been upturned. We established that in Act 1, Scene 1. Nonsense seems to be the sign of sanity and good thought. And it's interesting, as the fool leaves in 3.6, and by all means look ahead, there's a little couplet exchange between he and Lear as they go out of the storm. Lear says, we'll go to supper i'th morning. The fool replies, and I'll go to bed at noon. This is the first time in the play that Lear has let himself speak nonsense, effectively, to talk illogically, to talk what is in our upside-down world probably the first indication of the fact that he is, however slightly, on the mend. At this point, all the fool can do is essentially cap the couplet with one of his own, because his nonsense now has no power to help Lear any further. Lear has reached his point. They enter the hut, the hovel, and the fool is not seen again in the play. He's replaced essentially by Edgar in the shape of poor Tom, and of course by the suffering which will educate Lear throughout the entire play. Many directors decide that they need to explain the absence of the fool, and scenes are invented in which we see the fool being hung, being tortured, probably suggested by Lear's comment in Act 5, Scene 3, "Now my poor fool is hanged." But I think as the play tears on, and it does tear on, actually we don't notice that the fool isn't there. His place is taken by poor Tom, and frankly, to have two people talking with such a degree of license, freedom, illogicality would simply be overdoing it. The fool essentially becomes Tom. It's also worth noticing, of course, that the fool says, "I'll go to bed at noon," at roughly the midpoint of the play. Noon within the play itself, we see no more of the fool. So, quickly to move through Act 1, Scene 4, what does this scene actually do? It establishes Kent as loyal, prepared to act to support the king, and it establishes Goneril as well and truly evil, and in fact Lear, as the anger builds before his great curse, which I'll look at briefly on the next slide, uses that wonderful imagery of her as a detested kite, this carrion bird of prey that she is now likened to. It develops Lear's paganism in his great invocation to nature, which curiously seems to link him to Edmund, but be that as it may. And it also suggests the first hints of what will become a split between Goneril and Albany. There's no doubt who wears the trousers in that family. Albany's lines are constantly interrupted by Goneril, and there is a real sense that it is she that is the power in that household. Perhaps the most famous explosion in the scene is Lear's great curse. And it's worth just looking at it in a little bit of detail, not huge, as we conclude this screencast. I talked in an earlier screencast about the idea of meter, showing the degree, if you like, of emotional distress, and I think this is an interesting speech. In the first and third lines of the speech, the meter falls short. There are gaps, a whole foot, and actually a foot and a half. Pauses, this sense here, not that Lear, as I suggested with Edmund, is now out of breath with emotion, but Lear is in complete control. He doesn't need to fill his pentameter. Hear, nature, hear, dear goddess, hear, da-dum. Suspend thy purpose if thou didst intend to make this creature fruitful, dum-de-dum. There's a pause at the end of these lines, because Lear is in control as he starts this great invocation. It's interesting within it that he asks nature to confer sterility on Goneril, but also acknowledges that may not be possible, and I love the fact that he then asks for her to be given a child of spleen, suggesting somehow that a parent's faults are carried down into the child. She is obviously a splenetic woman in terms of her anger and her savagery. And seems completely oblivious of the fact that maybe his daughters have taken on rather more of his character than perhaps he thinks about, and certainly that we in the audience do notice this, I think. The closing lines, asking for the world again to be inverted, all her mother's pains and benefits to laughter and contempt. So this idea of turning everything back on its head. And actually, the meter is a very, very regular one. There's one extended line, granted. But generally, this is a very, very steady, settled, well-organised speech. There are ideas in it, obviously, probably 7 separate thoughts, but they're 7 separate thoughts in the same direction. This isn't darting around all over the place. Lear knows what he's doing here. This is not the speech of a man who is insane. I hope this has been useful. I hope you'll listen to it in conjunction with the others in the set, and I wish you the very best of luck with your studies.